Hey, what a great day to be an American, huh? I mean, here we are about 2 or 3 days before we kick off Thunder over Louisville. We got the Kentucky Derby ahead of us. The weather outside is awesome. We have more or less survived the coldest winter on the history of the planet. And we've had a great lunch at the Galt House. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, Paul. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you to the Louisville Rotary Club for doing great work globally as Rotarians, and for giving me the opportunity today to talk with you about something that's really important. It's important to our country, but it's also important to you as business owners, workers here in the Louisville region. So I'm happy to talk to you about that. I want to start off and tell you, I am the happiest guy in this room today. Now, some of you may question that. You might think that you're the happiest guy, but you're not, because I am. Now, I'm a happy guy because for a quarter of a century, I got to combine my passion and my profession, and that's always a good thing. As Paul indicated, I got to lead soldiers all over the world in defense of our country, and that was a blessing. And then when I retired, I got to come home to the bluegrass. Now, I've lived in about 25 different locations. I got a pretty good idea of all the great spots out there in the world, so I came back to Louisville not by coincidence, but by design, because this is the best place to live. So I'm happy to be not only speaking, but speaking here more than anything. And then when I retired and came home, I got to continue to work with a program to help soldiers transition off of active duty. Now, every year, about 130,000 soldiers take off their uniform and put on some variation of civilian clothes. 130,000 every year. Now, having done that myself, and many of you have done the same thing, if so, you'll probably understand and agree that that's a frightening task, and it's scary. So the Army puts them through a program that I'm honored to run. We run it out of Fort Knox, Kentucky, and what I'd like to do is kind of talk to you about that program. Now, you know that the main effort of our Army is to fight and win American wars. That's why we have an Army. That's why we pay them. That's why they exist. But as a side effect to that, we produce and give back to society every year, as I said, thousands of veterans. And those veterans have been trained and steeled and tested. And what I want to talk about today is just that, those veterans. I want to talk a little bit about who they are, what they know, and then what they can do for you. Not what you can do for them, but what they can do for you is kind of the selling point. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about our soldiers and our Army. Hit the next couple, Zan, and get the numbers up there. This is a frightening slide, and I expect everybody here to be scared to death after you wrap your head around this slide. Next one, please. The long and short of it is, if you take 100 American youth between 18 and 24 years old, these are our nieces and nephews, maybe children or grandchildren, the kids up and down the street, 100 of them, only about a quarter of them are eligible to join our Army. 3/4 of that 100 across America, 3 out of 4 cannot join the Army because they're overweight, they dropped out of high school, or they have some kind of a drug or police record problem. 3 out of 4. Now, regardless of what else I say today, that's frightening. Hit the final button, please. So a couple of things come to mind. First off, people ask me all the time, hey, should we have a draft? I think we should have a draft. Back in the old days, we had a draft. We can't have a draft. Our country won't support a draft because you can't draft 3 out of 4 people. We won't take them. But the other part is those we do hire, by definition, are a little more healthy, a little more disciplined, and a little more educated than the average. So I ask you, as employers, as business leaders, as Rotarians in our community, how many of you want to hire somebody that's a little more healthy, a little more educated, a little more disciplined than the average. And I think the answer is everybody wants to hire that kind of person. So what we've done as America's Army is to focus on that kind of person. So we've taken that roughly 25% and we focused our recruiting on them. And then we've given them some skills and attributes that I'll talk about here next. So the skills that you learn in the Army, many of them are the same skills that you have in your society. In your hometown, in your community, in your business, you've got plumbers, you've got bankers, you've got computer people, you've got electricians, you've got truck drivers, and the Army has all that too. In addition to that, of course, the Army has combat soldiers. The types of soldiers are really broken down into these three categories. Combat soldiers, like infantrymen, like special forces soldiers, guys like me. Combat support soldiers, like engineers and communicators and police officers. And then combat service support, like clerks and chaplains and lawyers. Here's a little piece of data for you. You may think that most of the soldiers in our Army are in that group up on top. They're infantrymen or cannoneers or tank drivers. But in fact, that's not true. That was true back in the day, but as our technology has changed and our society has changed, so has the makeup of our force. So we've got the bulk of our Army that does the support roles in the bottom two groupings right there. Now the pointy end of the spear, where the metal hits the road, literally, is in the top paragraph with the combat soldiers. But all those skills that you have in society exist in our military society as well. So I'll list just a couple on the next there about some civilian skills that you all have in your industry, we certainly have in our community, and we have the same ones across our Army. Of course, medical, dental, law enforcement, finance, aviation, et cetera, all the things that you need, we have somebody in the Army that does that. And then in addition to the skills, which we teach them, we also have some attributes which we recruit from society. Remember the 3 out of 4 thing a minute ago? So that last 1 out of 4 has some of the attributes that we're looking for, that you all are looking for too, I'm sure. And then we reinforce that not only through the training aspect, but through the attributes. So here's a confusing thing that I get from civilian employees all the time. I frequently get the question about what kind of Army skills do we have? And we may or may not have the exact skill set you're looking for, but if you'll ask the next question, which is what kind of personality attributes do you have, I'm certain we have the attributes that everybody's looking for. So don't confuse one with the other. Skills we teach, attributes we grow and ferment over years. So those attributes, those like honesty and integrity and the ability to work with a team, the ability to work under stress, we facilitate and we encourage, and then we test and test and test, and we literally test under fire so that the end product, that second effect product beyond our national security and defense of our Constitution, which is the reason we exist, that second product is a veteran that we can give back to society a little better trained, a little better disciplined, and a little more steeled and tested than the compatriots, even the 25% or so who meet that standard. So remember, I said 135,000 veterans or soldiers every year take the uniform off. They all go through a program called the Transition Assistance Program that we run at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Many of you know, I'm sure, that Fort Knox about 5 years ago had a significant change in culture. All the tankers at Fort Knox went to Fort Benning. Incidentally, I was at Fort Benning, Georgia a couple of weeks ago, and it's cats and dogs living together down there. Tankers and paratroopers on the same fort, there were lightning bolts coming down on a regular basis. It's fun to watch, but it's all good stuff. So we replaced the armor school for the Army with the Human Resource Center of Excellence. So just about everything that has to do with personnel, with soldiers, with people, happens out of Fort Knox. either directly or indirectly. And that's a huge coincidence, by the way. Fort Knox is about a half an hour. I just left there this morning after a couple of meetings. Yet every single personnel policy program that the Army has for a really big organization happens right down the road. So by sheer coincidence of geography, you all have kind of an insider's look. And I know there's a lot of smart people here in the Louisville area that are looking under the tent to work on that. So this slide just tells you what the Army does to prepare soldiers to transition. Now, soldiers have been transitioning out of the U.S. Army for about 225 years. It's nothing new. Back in the old days, they simply got a handshake, and they might have gotten to keep their horse or their musket, depending on how well they did, and then they rode back home to the farm. It's a little different now. I'll tell you, when my father was transitioned in 1946 after World War II, at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, he stood in line with everybody else. He got up to the clerk at the front of the line. The clerk looked at his name and said, "Here's your ticket, there's the bus, next." And that was the Transition Assistance Program right there. So we've matured that a little bit, thank goodness. Although that generation, God bless them, landed on their feet and built our country into the country it is today. But we have matured our program so that we now run a program out of Fort Knox that's significant. Every one of those 130,000 soldiers or so gets counseling on about a dozen things listed up here on the board. They all get a resume, they all get a budget, they all learn how to interview, they all learn how to search for jobs, they all learn how to dress for success. I told people when I retired as a colonel, after having commanded at a pretty significant level and done some pretty neat things, the only civilian job I'd ever had was cutting grass in my parents' neighborhood. So I'd hoped at least after doing all this stuff, being a colonel, being around the world, at least I could ride a zero-turn lawnmower. I didn't qualify for that job, but I did qualify for this job, so here we are. So about 3 or 4 years ago, right when I took this job at Fort Knox, right at the time that the command moved from Washington, D.C. to Kentucky, the same time all the tanks moved from Kentucky to Georgia, the Army did a big survey. We asked thousands and thousands and thousands of soldiers, what do you expect in transitions assistance, out of transition assistance? I mean, what are you looking for at the end of that time in uniform? What does the Army owe you? And here's what they said, oddly enough. They said, the Army doesn't owe me a job. I'll get the job. I just want the Army, this is the soldier speaking now, I just want the Army to prepare me so that when I have that handshake, I know what to do next. So based off of that feedback, we built this program. It takes about a week and a half or 2 weeks for every soldier to go through, for a soldier to go through. We try to spread it out over a year or so, a couple days here, a couple days there. The Army's invested a lot of money. I have about 700 counselors at about 75 locations. So if you're transitioning at Fort Knox or Fort Benning or Fort Bragg or Germany or Korea or Japan, it doesn't matter. You get the same level counseling, you get the same product at the end, which is these things here on the board. And you get a final introduction, ideally, you get a final introduction to an employer that wants to hire somebody like you. So about 135,000 soldiers, give or take. About a third of them every year are going home, no matter what. Come hell or high water, I'm going home. In my case, I grew up here in Louisville. My wife grew up here in Louisville. She's a professor at University of Louisville, by the way. My father and mother, as you know, live here, my sister, so I was coming to Louisville. Even if I didn't get to drive the zero-turn mower, I was coming to Louisville. That's about a third of the soldiers that are going home. About a third of the soldiers will stay where the Army left them, maybe because their spouse has got a good job, their kids are in school, they like the neighborhood, whatever. Some of you, perhaps, I know many of you have taken uniform off and maybe stayed where the Army left you, maybe you went home, or maybe the other third goes to wherever there's a good job or good enticing opportunity. So what that means to you as employers is that you've got a huge potential of possible employees that will either A, come home to Louisville. Louisville sends about 1,500 soldiers a year to the Army. from the region. So roughly a third, 500, 600 are coming here no matter what. Another third, another 500 or 600 would be happy to come here if there's something to bring them here. And then a third of the overall Army, some 30,000, would be happy to come here if they had the opportunity. So that's called potential. And one of the reasons why I'm so happy to talk to the Rotary Club, and anytime I get the opportunity to talk to folks about this, is just to tell you there's some untapped potential out there. So how do you tap into it? That's the million-dollar question. Lunch was certainly worth $1 million. I didn't get to finish it, but I'm going to here in a minute. So that's the big question. How do you tap into that potential? There's a couple of ways. So the Army has taken the onus not only to prepare soldiers, which is the slide I showed you a minute ago, but also to connect soldiers. Because there's a lot of companies out there that want to hire soldiers. We get calls from big companies all the time, Ford, Coke, Toyota, you name it, every company you've ever heard of. So we've asked those companies, big or small, to go on the webpage there in the middle, Soldier for Life webpage or h2h.jobs webpage, and apply and put their job application on there, because I tell every one of the 130,000 soldiers, look at this webpage, and they search it by location, by job type, by salary, all kinds of stuff for potential jobs. And then, or you can call that number or that email, or certainly call and contact me, and we'll try to put you in place. But here's another reason why I'm so excited to be here with the Louisville Rotary Club today. Because my hometown, the River City, is really the first in the nation that's kind of taken it the next step. So historically, individual companies have contacted transitioning soldiers. Let's say Ford Motor Company says, I want to hire some number, or Sears and Roebuck wants to hire some number of soldiers, and that's great. God bless them. But we really haven't had a community to pool all that together and bring it to soldiers and say, this region needs X number of soldiers. And not only do we offer jobs, but we also offer other things, the things that you and I are interested in, like schools, healthcare, cost of living, parks, basketball teams, football teams, all the good stuff. So Louisville, the Louisville Chamber of Commerce, in coordination with other local chambers and regional leaders, have put together an initiative to really do that, to wrap that all together so that the region can sell itself as a region instead of 100 different companies saying, come here, come here, come here, come here. In that survey I mentioned a moment ago, one of the comments from the soldiers is that we are simultaneously drowning and dying of thirst. There's so much information out there, but I can't drink it because it's just overwhelming me. So this region, your region, our region, is trying to package that together with the Where Opportunity Knocks program that they're going to unveil, I think, in just a month or two. It's going to be great, champagne bottles, confetti from the ceiling, everything, to come together as a region and try to market to some of these 130,000 or so soldiers and their spouses and kids and all that stuff. So I want to end like I started a couple of moments ago. What an awesome day to be an American. We are outrageously blessed beyond our comprehension with our freedoms, our Constitution, our health, and our wealth. And as a side effect, as a byproduct of supporting and defending that Constitution, we produce hundreds of thousands of soldiers that are trained, morally and physically strong, that have resilience to survive and be victorious on the battlefield, which is the same kind of thing that you need in your industry. So I tell folks all the time, and I will tell you, and this is a foot stomper, by the way. I don't know if civilians do this, but in the Army, when you go to a school, when the instructor stomps his foot, that means wake up and pay attention. So this is a foot stomper. Don't hire soldiers to be patriotic. Don't hire soldiers because you owe it to them. Hire soldiers because they will help your bottom line. They will help your company, your organization, your structure be stronger, more agile, more decentralized, all the things that you want. And we're happy to do that. So what I hope to do now, I'm outnumbered roughly 200 to 1. My back is to the wall. I could probably outrun a couple of you, but I don't think I could outrun all of you. So I really look forward to some hard and challenging questions that I can talk about this topic or what other topics as you may see fit. Yes, sir.
First, I want to give you a round of applause and thank you for your service and great speech. I don't know if I have my facts right on this or not, but I meet a lot of young men that love the Army, and they say, I'd like to re-enlist. But my unit's been not being deployed, they're downsizing, my unit's being dissolved, and they tell me otherwise, I'm in good standing with the Army, but I can't re-enlist. But then on the other hand, I see that they're still recruiting and bringing in new people. Right. Am I missing something? I'm wondering why more of these people aren't allowed to enlist, if that's really true.
Great question. First, never let the lack of facts get in the way of a good question.
Right.
But that is a good question.
I did qualify my question.
No, that's good. No, you are correct. The Army, because of its kind of intensity, drives youth and turnover. So we will always recruit large numbers of young people because it's basically a young person's event. You don't want a bunch of 35 or 40-year-old riflemen. You want a few leading the way, but you want a bunch of 18, 19, 20-year-olds. So we are reducing the number that we recruit, and we're increasing the number that we do not allow to re-enlist. So 10 years ago, if any soldier said, I want to re-enlist, you are re-enlisted. But now a lot of soldiers are saying, I'd like to re-enlist, and the Army says, I'm sorry, but we're getting smaller, and part of the structure that we're reducing is your part. So some of these soldiers who are going to be getting out over the next few years don't want to. And maybe 5 or 10 or 20 years ago would not have gotten out, but now they are getting out. So they still got the motivation and drive, but because we're reducing, we're reorganizing, it's a restructuring thing that every civilian industry in this room certainly is familiar with.
If you enlist now, what is the expected stint? What is the contract? What are you signing up for? How many years?
Typically, a soldier signs for 3 years on active with an additional 4 or 5 in the reserve component. So that's kind of the norm. A young man or woman signs up for a total of 8, about half of them active and half of them reserve.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your service, Colonel. How do you measure the success of the transition program, short-term and long-term?
Yeah, that's a good question. And let me tell you, the long-term measurement is really hard, and we're trying to figure out. The short-term measurement, I can count how many soldiers got a resume, how many got a budget, and how many made a job application. That's fairly easy. The long-term measurement that we're trying to figure out is how many of them got an interview and how many of them got a job offer. In order to do that, of course, we need information from industry, and that's hard to get because you people don't work for us. And it frustrates the heck out of me, although you're, I'm sure, happy with it. But so that's really the challenge, how to get that feedback, because once they take the uniform off and go out into the, that big country, it's hard to track it down. So short term, we measure how many get resumes and send out job applications and budgets and that sort of thing. And the vast majority of them are meeting most of the important gates. Good question. Yes, sir.
Yes, in today's Wall Street Journal, on the op-ed page is, I think, a marvelous article written by a psychiatrist who has a great Army background. And he said if arms were allowed on the base, Army bases, that the tragedies we've had at Fort Hood would not have happened. How do you feel about arming soldiers on the base?
Well, that's a great question. Okay, so let me give a disclaimer. The answer I'm going to give you does not represent that of the U.S. federal government. Got that?
That's a disclaimer.
Okay, however, I believe that soldiers inherently defend themselves and their colleagues well. That's what we get paid to do. There's a federal law, not local policy at all the installations, but a federal law that negates the opportunity to carry a concealed weapon on a federal installation, even if you have a permit. So if you have a carry and conceal permit, like I do, for example, but by federal law, I cannot carry it on a federal installation. So what that means is, if you're a bad guy and you're looking for large groups of people who are not armed, there they are on federal installations, ready to go, and you can make a huge political point for whatever reason. So I think there's some validity to that statement. Yes, sir.
You were looking for a tough question, so I'll try one here. One of the biggest issues we have in hiring, and I won't get too personal here, but is drugs. In other words, we hire people. In fact, even after we hire them, we give them a drug test and they fail. I can't even believe they showed up for the test, but they did. What are you doing in your office to send us people where that is not going to be an issue?
Yeah, great question. So anybody who gets an honorable discharge from the Army, you can rest assured did not use drugs while in the Army, because we are really serious about drug abuse, and we test people, constantly, every couple of weeks, monthly. But it's a big Army, and clearly out of 130,000 people, some of them are doing the wrong things. And oh, by the way, some of them are also, small numbers are getting kicked out for doing bad things. So they come from a culture. You remember the attributes I talked about earlier? They come from a culture where drug abuse is not tolerated. Now, they reflect American society, just as we all reflect American society, the society from which we came, and many of them may go back to the culture from which they came, which may be more supportive of drug abuse. So I can't tell you that it's impossible. I will tell you that I'm fairly certain that veterans are a whole lot cleaner than non-veterans because they've had that culture of no drugs. Good question, though. Yes, sir.
Hey, Colonel, thanks for being here. Your talk today kind of reminded me of my first time I was interviewed. I had this wonderful man by the name of John Weber. He had his chair and desk situated such so you were a little bit lower than him when he interviewed you. Now, this is on the last tail end. He owned the company. And he had this sign that hung over his head. It kind of, I can still see it bobbling over top of his head: lead, follow, or get the hell out of the way. And I was an art student, just going to work for this agency, and I looked, I felt, oh boy, I don't know if I want to join this place or not. Well, over the years, I learned what he was talking about, and I worked for him for several years. And I started my own business and then had a little small manufacturing company. The message that you just said about hiring the soldier, if you've had a manufacturing company, you've hired people that, I'm not saying at minimum wage, but they're close. Trying to vet those individuals that will pay attention, lead, or follow. You have to learn how to follow the lead, of course, and I think that's an axiom that most people need to learn. But the soldier that we would hire, who is mustered out, we knew that he knew how to take direction, and he was going to be a loyal person. All you had to do is treat him right and give him direction, point him in the right direction. So I wanted to say that as for anybody that has a doubt about this, about hiring a soldier, you're going to get a wonderful individual if he's mustered out and he's got an honorable discharge, because he knows how to work. The other thing that I wanted to ask you about is your book, which I have read, Unconventional Warrior. It is one of the most common sense books that I have read in terms of leadership and an approach to the military and what it's about. Could you share with us a little bit? And I did not publish this book. So this is not shameless.
But I did buy it. So that's
but I was taken back by how much common sense was in this, and your experiences and how you portrayed them personally. And you were very personal about some of the experiences that you had in your career. But could you tell us a little bit about that book? And you might want to add a little bit about some of the wars that we are in and trying to get out, extracting ourselves from, because you had some wonderful thoughts on that I think folks would like to hear, frankly.
Well, I appreciate that, and I'll be happy to. I will once again take myself out of the mode. This is not the federal government talking here. This is simply a Louisville neighbor and an old soldier. But I wrote that book over a 3-year period. Took about 2 years to write it. Took about a year to get it through the Pentagon security check. Imagine that. and to get it published, and came out this summer. And really the long and short of the book is that our national strategy against the while fighting this global war on terror, I feel, is terminally flawed. America has had the same inherent strategy since about 1865, 1864, when U.S. Grant took the reins of the U.S. Army, and that has been a strategy of mass and force, which works brilliantly in some scenarios. In this global war against terror, where the enemy will not go toe-to-toe, I think it is a flawed strategy, and the correct strategy is an indirect, unconventional approach where we use the enemy's weaknesses against them, not their strengths. Their strengths are patience. Our weakness is patience. America has very little patience. I personally have very little patience, and our society has very little patience. The enemy has endless patience. The book tells a story, an old Afghan man who looked like Moses, robe, long white beard, pointed to his naked wrist and said, "You Americans have all the watches, but we have all the time." And that, when you get your head around it, really summarizes the challenge with our strategy, where we're trying to do something this year or next year, or longest case within a 4-year election cycle, and they're looking at something 10, 20, 30, 40 years. If properly packaged, America does have patience. World War II ended in Europe in May of 1945, and lo and behold, 65, 70 years later, we still have soldiers in Europe. Why is that? It's because we know that strategically, Europe is important. We cannot afford for anything bad to happen, and we're gonna keep our finger on the pulse. Yet in the Middle East, which is much more complicated than Europe, for whatever reason, we try to get in and out, over a fairly short cycle. So that book that does argue vehemently against much of our national strategy, military and political, kind of summarizes along those lines. So I appreciate your comment, and I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. First of all, I definitely appreciate your service and the service and contribution of your father. I want you to talk just a little bit about transitioning from a soldier standpoint, having soldiers that have been in the field going back and forth from deployment after deployment, because as a retired soldier and now being in industry, we're finding that some of our soldiers are experiencing some challenges in adaptation once they are on the job, and I'm trying to figure out what the Army is doing about that.
Yeah, great question, and that's a very appropriate question too. As many of you know, you certainly know, war changes people. It just does. Whether it's the current war, my father's war, my grandfather, great-grandfather, nobody goes to war and comes home the same person. Nobody. Some of them it changes for the better, some of them it changes for the worse, some of them it just affects, and it takes time to get over it. And it has and does affect me and many of you, I'm sure. So the good news is that we as a society, as an American military, and really a national society, are starting to understand fairly recently that all wounds are not physical. It's easy if you have to identify if you have a bullet hole in blood. We understand what that looks like, but some wounds are not visible. But they are certainly wounds just as much as any other gunshot or whatever case might be. Like other wounds, some heal quicker or slower than others. The risk, however, the negative part about understanding this and about bending over to support those wounded soldiers is that society now, in many cases, thinks that all soldiers have some kind of ticking time bomb thing in their head, which I certainly don't believe is true. I know nobody here does as well, but it's easy to see because when we turn on the TV, you don't go too long until you hear a story about some crazy soldier doing something bad. Remember, 130,000 a year, and some number of those, just like 130,000 civilians, some number of those are going to have issues, a much, much smaller number than on the civilian sector. But to your point, with multiple rotations in combat, that impacts everybody, as many of you know. But with the resilience and the training and the steeling that the Army inherently has, our intent is to let people recover from those pains. And I think we're doing that about as well as can be done. Is it still painful? Absolutely. Good question, though. Yes, sir.
I wonder what you think is going to happen in Iraq and Afghanistan as Obama's pulling all of our troops out of there.
Well, I know you all have to be home by dinner, so I'm not sure I can address that fully, but I will tell you that there's some wide open possibilities. Some of them tolerable, some of them not. I think there's enough goodness in both of those locations that good things, meaning a relatively stable society, could prosper. The challenge is, in that part of the world, the tendency is to kind of be quiet, be silent. In the Western world, certainly the United States, if something bad happens in any of your neighborhoods, the neighbors pretty soon put their arms together and stop it. They just won't tolerate it. But in the Middle East, that's not always the case, because there's centuries of kind of just keep your own business, stay out of my business. So there's a trend going against us that way. I think if you look at it larger than the Middle East and look at a global war on terror, not a regional war in the Middle East, but a global war against Muslim extremists, the risk is we have proven again that we don't have a lot of patience. We're fighting a war where the enemy has patience as their number one weapon, and we have shown again that patience is our vulnerability. So I think we're at a huge risk for the near future on where we're going with the war. Incidentally, that's another non-official government statement I just made. Yes, sir.
Going back to re-enlistment, the young man that wants to re-enlist, I'm assuming you're talking about non-officers. My question is, management running the Army, who's in charge, are you also telling the officer after 3 or 4 years he's been in college, he's an ROTC graduate, he spent 3 years now, he's good, he wants to re-enlist, are you telling him no, he can't re-enlist too? What are you doing about the officers, the management?
Yes, sir, that's a good question. We will tell over the next few years thousands of officers, just like we tell thousands of young enlisted, tens of thousands of young enlisted, because there's so many more of them, of course. Thank you for your service. You've done an awesome job. We're downsizing, and your services are no longer needed, so thank you very much. That happens at a large scale. West Point graduates, ROTC graduates, multiple tours in combat graduates. So for those, it will be hard to stomach, and that's going to be a rude awakening for them. That's a good question, though.